Joining me to discuss his 2024 Libertarian presidential bid is founder and president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, Jacob Hornberger. Mr. Hornberger, thank you for joining me here today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me as your guest, Michael.
Let's go through your political history a bit to start off. You ran as an independent in Virginia's 2002 Senate election and as a Libertarian in the 2000 and 2020 presidential elections. One of the biggest aspects of your campaign is you say you want to end the federal killing machine. What exactly does that entail?
Well, Martin Luther King called the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And I don't think anybody can deny that. Now, he said it back in 1968, but I think everyone would agree that it applies to today. We don't know exactly how many people the federal government has killed in the last, say, 60, 70 years, but it's certainly got to number in the millions, either directly or indirectly. We're talking about federal government programs like America's socialist system of immigration controls, state-sponsored assassinations, all the invasions, the occupations, engendering wars between other nations, the coups. When you add all these things up, you're talking about an enormously large number of people that have been killed by the federal government, and they continue to be killed by the federal government through its policies, primarily through the national security establishment, but certainly through other agencies. The drug war, another example of massive death toll from that program. So one of the major reasons I'm running for president and seeking the Libertarian Party nomination is to bring this killing machine to an end. It is totally contrary to America's legacy of liberty and private property and limited government.
You touch on a lot there, and we'll get to that over the course of this interview. But I want to ask you about an event that happened a few days ago, and that's regarding Russia. Russia has suspended its involvement in the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which allowed Ukraine to ship its grain globally via the Black Sea Corridor. What do you make of the Kremlin's decision?
I don't really involve myself in that kind of minutia. I like to think in terms of a much bigger picture rather than, examining how Russia should manage its foreign policy or how Ukraine should manage its foreign policy. I really think our focus should be here in the United States. We have a malignant cancer on the body politic, and that's the national security state form of governmental structure under which we've all been born and raised. That was not our original founding system. Our original founding system was a limited government republic, which is what I favor. And I think this is where the focus of the American people has to be, because this is one of the major root causes of this killing machine, this death machine. And so rather than focus in on what Russia's doing and what Ukraine's doing or what's China doing and so forth, I want Americans to focus on what we need to do here to get this country back on the right track, the track toward liberty, peace, prosperity, and harmony with the people of the world. And that necessarily means extracting U.S. forces from overseas and interventionism overseas, ending all that. But it also is necessary to take it one step further and remove this malignant, cancerous tumor from the American body politic.
As president, you will more than likely have to deal with international leaders. How will you not do that? What's your response?
Well, I don't believe that. If you have a type of foreign policy on which the government was founded, that is a non-interventionist foreign policy, you stay out of the affairs of other nations. Why do you have to deal with foreign leaders? I mean, now you're talking about just liberating the American people to travel wherever they want to travel, trade wherever they want to trade, stay out of foreign conflicts, stay out of foreign wars, don't engender any of these things. You no longer have a CIA instituting coups and regime change operations overseas. You leave the world to manage its own affairs, but you liberate the American people to interact with the world. Today, it's the exact opposite. You've got enormous restrictions on the freedom of the American people to travel and trade wherever they want to. And the Cuban embargo is a good example of that. And you've unleashed the Pentagon and the CIA to go and do their death machine around the world. So if you do the reverse, there's really no reason why you have to interact with any foreign leader except to say hello to them in a polite way. But why else would you need to do them? do that. For example, trade. It's just imbued in the American psyche that you have to have trade agreements. And so that necessarily means you have to interact with foreign leaders. Well, we got to negotiate this trade agreement. Well, if you take my position of unilateral free trade, where you just eliminate all trade restrictions on the freedom of the American people to travel and trade, you don't need to deal with any foreign leader. You just liberate your people to do whatever they want with respect to travel and trade.
Now, I do want to go a bit more into your foreign policy. You say you do want to end all foreign aid, including to Ukraine, which is different than some of your competitors who believe that the United States should be supplying Ukraine throughout this war. You disagree.
Absolutely. I oppose all foreign aid. I mean, foreign aid is just another form of welfare. It's money that is taken from American taxpayers who have worked hard for that money. It's their money, and it's being seized by them from the IRS in order to give it to foreign leaders, and in this case, the foreign leaders in the Ukraine government. And it's being sold as, oh, well, this reflects our care and our compassion. That's ridiculous. Where is the care and compassion involved in the IRS? I mean, this is one of the most brutal, terrifying, terrorizing agencies in the history of this country. If you don't pay your taxes, they come after you with a vengeance. And so the fact that the government is helping out another government doesn't reflect any care or compassion at all. It's all based on just political considerations. So I would end all foreign aid, not just to Ukraine, but to every other regime around the world.
Now, you say you would try and minimize interaction with foreign leaders. There's been a lot of talk in the news about a prisoner exchange, specifically regarding detained Wall Street Journal journalist Evan Gershkovich. Gershkovich has been accused of espionage, which his employer, the Wall Street Journal, has denied. Now, I ask you this because you recently published an article questioning whether the journal has published Gershkovich's full side of the story. You allege it could be relating to whether Gershkovich accepted confidential Russian documents. I want to ask you, do you have any additional information or sources to back this up?
Well, no, I made it very clear that that's just speculation, that Gershkovich now has had time to meet with his lawyer in Russia. And I just found it interesting that the journal has not published his side of the story. I mean, surely his lawyer would have received his side of the story and possibly shared it with the journal and said, hey, this is what the guy says. I mean, that would just be logical. And I just wondered why the journal isn't sharing his side of the story, if for no other reason than to show he's innocent rather than just saying he's innocent. And so I'm speculating that what might have happened here is that Gershkovich was set up by Russian officials, where they had an inside guy, an informant, meet with Gershkovich and hand him over materials because he was writing on Russia foreign policy, the Russia's war in Ukraine, handed him materials, and Gershkovich thought, well, this guy is probably a trusted source, and then lo and behold, there it is, a confidential information. But that's all speculation. I'm saying that would have been a logical way to take this guy into custody. Now, the reason I say that is because this is exactly how the U.S. government operates. I mean, the U.S. government started this game, and it's a classic example of how U.S. foreign policy that is managed by the Pentagon and the CIA and to a certain extent the NSA makes life more dangerous for Americans. They started this with a Russian citizen named Victor Bout, an arms dealer. They set him up in Thailand, of all things. It was a DEA operation. Now, what's the drug enforcement operation agency having to do with a gun runner in Thailand? But they set him up and they extradited him to the United States, and they gave him a huge sentence. I mean, I think the guy served 10 years before he was finally traded. And then they took Maria Butina, a Russian citizen, who was nothing more than just a young woman that was trying to establish better relations between Russia and the United States. They took her into custody and charged her with failing to register as a foreign agent. And so when you start playing that game, it shouldn't surprise you that the Russians are going to play it right back. And so they have played it back, obviously, with Gershkovich, as well as the basketball star Griner that they took into custody. So it's just, again, an example of what foreign interventionism can do to make life more miserable for the American people.
Would you support a prisoner exchange in this scenario?
Well, yeah, absolutely. But again, you see, you're talking about trimming the branches. That's going to do no good. Well, it'll do good for those who are being exchanged, obviously, but that doesn't get to the root of the problem. And this is what distinguishes my campaign from other campaigns. If you just trim the branches of a weed, that weed is going to come back stronger than ever. You have to look and see what is the root cause of what's going on here. And then you pull the weed out by its root. And the root cause of this is all of this anti-Russia hostility, the renewed Cold War that the Pentagon and the CIA have been engendering ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. They were never ready to let the old Cold War racket go. And that's what it was. It was a racket. And they've succeeded in that. And that's why you have to, in order to get rid of these problems that require prisoner exchanges, you got to go back to what the root is and pull the root out. And then you never get into this problem, because regimes are not retaliating against each other by going after their respective citizenry.
Now, another event that happened today as we're recording this, July 18th, former President Trump claims he received a target letter from the Justice Department regarding his involvement on January 6th, and he is likely to be indicted a third time. Some people say that the former president should be barred from running for public office. What would you say about that?
I would say, of course, he should not be barred from running for public office, and the law is that he isn't barred from running for public office. And I think it's fairly obvious that these criminal prosecutions are designed to discourage him from running. I have no doubts that if he were to make a public announcement that he was not going to be running for president, all these charges would be dropped. That they hate this guy so much that it borders on the obsession. And the obsession is, we got to stop him at all costs. And they're using the criminal justice process as a way to do that, just like Russia does. I mean, this is one of the things we've copied from Russia. Putin is a master at recognizing who his opponents are going to be in the next presidential race and figuring out a criminal prosecution, some kind of tax violation or whatever. And that's what they're doing with Trump. They're going after him on ridiculous charges that don't belong in the criminal justice system. Now, that's not to say that I think very highly of Donald Trump as president. I think he would be a disaster, just like he was a disaster during his first 4 years. Nonetheless, I don't think they ought to be prosecuting him, and I certainly don't think they should be barring him from running for office again.
Now, you mentioned that some of these charges are ridiculous, if I hear you correctly. Do you also believe that the false claims that he said that the election was stolen are also ridiculous?
Well, I do, in large part because there's never been any evidence that that's the case. Now, I think the media let down the American people, though, by automatically assuming that to be the case. It's the job of the media to investigate these kind of allegations, because certainly there were anomalies that people were pointing out, statistical anomalies with respect to the surges in vote totals. And you want an independent press to investigate those. Instead of just saying, oh, it's automatically bogus, it's just bogus. And that's what the press did. From the very beginning, they even were commenting their news reports saying groundless allegations by Donald Trump. Well, a reporter is not supposed to issue commentary like that. And if you had an independent press aggressively investigating the charges, everybody would feel good about that. Say, okay, everything's fine because the press has investigated it. They're independent. They haven't found anything. The press never did that. They never really investigated anything. But by the same token, the Trump people could never prove anything. And so if you can't prove something, for all practical purposes, you're finished as far as your allegations concerned. It's time to move on. Now, I'm a native Texan. I come from South Texas, where Lyndon Johnson stole the 1948 Senate race in Texas, and back then when he stole it by cramming the box 13 in Jim Wells County, which was right near my county, the people were saying the same thing. Oh, these are groundless conspiracy theories and that sort of thing. Well, some 30, 40 years later, the author Robert Caro proved through a sworn affidavit by the guy who actually crammed the box 13 with those ballots, those fake bogus ballots, that he had done it. And if he had not succeeded in that, Johnson would never have been president, which means we wouldn't have had the Vietnam War, most likely, and so forth. So I don't discount the possibility that elections are stolen, because they are stolen sometimes. It's just that the Trump people could never prove it. And so if you can't prove something, it's time to just move on.
Let's transition more towards your domestic policy, specifically talking about abortion. The House of Representatives voted to restrict abortion access in the military. Of course, abortion is still on many Americans' minds in the wake of last year's overturning of Roe versus Wade. A May 2023 Gallup poll found that 85% of respondents believed abortion should be legal in some capacity. You say that you are pro-life. So am I wrong in saying that you support what happened in the House?
Well, no, I mean, look, again, when we talk about the military, that there's always the question of, well, how should the government run its operations? How should the government run its military? Well, I favor a dismantling of the whole national security establishment. This is what I said earlier. This is an alien form of governmental structure. The Pentagon, the vast military industrial complexes, President Eisenhower referred to it when he said this is a grave threat to our way of life here in the United States. The CIA, the NSA. I want to restore a limited government republic with just a small, relatively basic military force. So I don't really get into the controversy as to how the government should run its military, what kind of policies it wants on there. I rather get people to focus on why we need to dismantle this apparatus. Now, okay, I'm pro-life. I believe life begins at conception. I'm a Catholic. But the Supreme Court's made it very clear now that this is no longer a federal issue. This is a state issue. Each state is going to define whether it's going to criminalize abortion or not. And so it's just a matter of majority rule. I mean, that's really what this thing now boils down to, that it's going to be majority rule. And nothing I say is going to affect that. And so you just let the chips fall where they may. Some states are going to be making it illegal. Other states are going to be making it legal. And that's just the way it is. And there's no way that you can alter that at this point.
So this is an issue that should be left to the states, in your opinion?
Well, it is left to the states. My opinion is irrelevant. That with the overturning of Roe versus Wade, it is now left to the states. Before, the states were not free to enact abortion prohibitions. And now, with the overturning of Roe versus Wade, they are. And so each state's going to make that decision. And my opinion really doesn't make any difference one way or the other. Some states are going to make it legal. Other states are going to make it illegal. That's just the way it is now. It's going to be run by majority vote, like it or not. Let me add something important here to this, because, you know, Republicans always profess, Michael, that they're pro-life, but this is just sheer hypocrisy. Because if you look at U.S. foreign policy and the death machine that I mentioned at the very start of this interview, they're killing countless children overseas with their death policies, their invasions, their occupations, and they don't give a hoot about this. I mean, they don't know how many children they killed in Afghanistan and Iraq, undeclared wars. They don't care. And when they had the sanctions against Iraq, and as a way to get rid of Saddam Hussein, they were killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. Madeleine Albright expressed the mindset of both Democrats and Republicans perfectly. She was asked in 1996 whether the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children from U.S. sanctions and UN sanctions was worth it. 500,000 children. And she says, yeah, it was worth it. And everybody agreed with her. I mean, nobody, even in the mainstream press, condemned her for that statement, because that's the mindset. Foreign children don't matter. Their lives just don't matter. They're not like American children. And so when I hear Republicans saying that they're pro-life, I just laugh and scoff, because I know how hypocritical it is. Under God's laws, the lives of foreigners are just as valuable as the lives of Americans.
Now, you mentioned sanctions, and sanctions are another large aspect of your campaign. You say that you will terminate any sanctions or embargoes currently in place. So what would your administration do if a country were to threaten America? Would you do anything economically to punish them?
Well, keep in mind when I say that I would do these things, I favor the lifting of all sanctions and embargoes. Some of them have been imposed by Congress, which clearly requires a congressional legislation to repeal them, like the embargo against Cuba. Um, yeah, I want this is what distinguishes me from my opponents in the LP presidential race too. I favor a complete separation of economy and the state. I want when I say free enterprise, I'm genuinely meaning an enterprise system where American business activity, economic activity is totally free of all government control and regulation, preferably with a constitutional amendment. We have a constitutional amendment that prohibits the government from regulating or controlling religious activity. And so even if the government really wants to control a church, they cannot do it. That's what I favor with respect to economic activity. I believe the state should play no role whatsoever in economic activity. So if some jerk over thousands of miles away says, well, we're going to impose tariffs on the American people and threatens us with the lifting of tariffs or import restrictions that prohibit American goods from being sold there, I want it so that the American government cannot retaliate. It is prohibited from retaliating, where the American people just say, well, okay, if you don't want us to sell goods to your people, that's your business. We'll go sell them elsewhere, but leave it entirely privatized. Leave the government out of it. Right now, you've got a system where economic activity and trade is politicized, totally politicized. So you get into all these crises that deal with sanctions and embargoes, like with respect to Iran or China or Russia. Once you get government out of it, all that goes away. And then you start developing harmonious relations, because there's no reason for governments to threaten the United States, because the government here doesn't have the power to retaliate with the lifting of tariffs or something like that.
I want to follow up on that with a specific example. The Biden administration has sanctioned several Chinese officials over human rights abuses, namely over its treatment of Uyghurs. It doesn't sound like those sanctions are something you support.
Absolutely not. It's hypocritical to the max. I mean, look, the U.S. government, as I indicated earlier, is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. I mean, Martin Luther King was right, as I indicated. So here's the greatest purveyor of violence in the world that has people in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, who have been held there for 20 years of their lives and been denied a trial, much less a trial by jury. I mean, they use kangaroo military tribunals in Guantanamo, but they don't even give them a military tribunal. They just hold them there for the rest of their lives. That's what's going on, or they torture them. And this government is lecturing the Chinese on human rights abuses. I mean, give me a break. All this does is just politicize problems. It creates conflict and hostility, which then the national security establishment uses as the excuse to fund their operations. Oh, we've got a new crisis with China now. This is none of the U.S. government's business, especially when it involves sheer hypocrisy. We all know this. This is what John Quincy Adams pointed out in his famous address on the 4th of July in 1821 to Congress. It's called In Search of Monsters to Destroy. We all know there's monsters around the world. We know there's bad things that happen around the world, monstrous things, abuses of human rights, torture, executions, famines, and so forth. But as Adams said, this government will not go abroad with forces, armed forces, to fix these matters, tyrannies, dictatorships, and so forth. Instead, we will be a model where people can come here. That's what the whole open borders idea was about, open immigration, where if people were suffering human rights abuses in China, they could escape from there and know that there was one nation. They would not return them to their country of origin. That doesn't exist anymore because of America's system of immigration controls. But that's the system I favor. Government officials here should just butt out of the affairs of other nations and liberate the American people to trade and travel and interact with the people of the world.
Now, even if you say it may be hypocrisy for the U.S. to talk about human rights, does the actions by China in particular, does that concern you in any way, shape, or form? Is there anything you would do about it as president?
Well, those are two separate questions. I mean, whenever somebody's being killed or tortured, or kept in in incarceration without a trial for 20 years or the rest of their lives, sure, how can you not feel sympathy for people that are suffering the abuses of tyrannies or dictatorships or other monstrous things? But again, I say this is no business of the U.S. government. This is a business of what is happening over there, or if American citizens decide they want to go travel overseas and lobby a foreign regime to change its policies or to free people, great. But getting the government involved only aggravates the situation. It makes it much worse for American citizens, because once then the crisis starts, they start with the sanctions against Chinese businesses, but they inevitably start expanding them. And they expand them to where they start harming the citizens of the country. I mean, look at Cuba, I mean, they target the Cuban people with death and suffering as a way to get regime change, because they don't like the human rights abuses of the communist regime there. Same thing with Iraq. They didn't like Saddam Hussein's human rights abuses. They impoverished the Iraqi people. They killed countless Iraqi children, like I pointed out earlier with Madeleine Albright's statement. That this thing, they never know when to stop. So when they target the president of a country, they inevitably see that it didn't do any good at all, so they start expanding them. And in the meantime, it makes life dangerous for Americans, because when we travel to that country as tourists, you never know when they're going to pick one of us up just because they're angry at what the U.S. government has done to them.
Now, you mentioned immigration. Your immigration policy is an open border policy. Why do you think that's the answer to some people who will say an open border will only harm citizens, will only make the country more and more dangerous?
Well, I grew up on the border. I grew up on a farm on the Rio Grande in South Texas. I spent almost half my life on the border, and I've seen this perpetual immigration crisis all my life. I've seen the death toll come in with people drowning in the Rio Grande and dying of thirst in the deserts in the Southwest, the backs of 18-wheelers, of asphyxiation. I've seen this all my life because of this system of immigration controls. This is what the advocates of immigration controls simply cannot acknowledge. This is a socialist system. It's based on the socialist principle of central planning. Central planning always produces chaos and crisis and death. That's what socialism has proven to be the bane of mankind. And we see it here. But the advocates of this system do not recognize that all this chaos on the border, this crisis on the border that's been there all of our lives, is a direct consequence of their very own system. The only way to get rid of this chaos and crisis is freedom and free markets, which means the free movements of goods, services, and people across borders. Abolishing the border patrol, abolishing the immigration service, the same system we have here on domestic borders where people are free to cross state borders back and forth. That's the system for international borders. And it's the only system that works. If you adopted that system today, tomorrow there would be no more deaths, no more suffering, no more chaos, no more crises. You wouldn't even talk about the immigration crisis anymore, because it would be over. People would just be crossing the border naturally. They don't have to become American citizens. They just come here and work and trade. You don't know who the people that you're trading with right now or interacting with are American citizens. You go to McDonald's and you hear people speaking Spanish there in the back. You don't go and say, "Can I see your papers? I want to make sure you're an American." Walmart doesn't check people's papers when they come in to buy things. And that's why freedom and free markets work so effectively. It's irrelevant what a person's nationality is in a genuinely free society. And so that's the reason, both morally and in a utilitarian sense, I argue that this is the only solution to America's immigration woes, to get government out of this area and let freedom and the free market work.
Now, there's also concern regarding the border of drugs, specifically fentanyl, coming into America. You have compared the war on drugs to prohibition. You've called it deadly, destructive, and racist. Doing as such, as president, you say you will legalize all drugs and pardon all nonviolent drug offenders. Why do you believe that to be the answer?
Well, again, I favor the legalization of all drugs. It would be up to Congress to repeal the drug laws. Look, this thing's been a fiasco, Michael. We all know this. I mean, it's the same fiasco that prohibition of alcohol inflicted on American society. You had Al Capone, you had the alcohol cartels, the the massive gunfights, the death, the destruction, the police corruption. And then as soon as they legalized alcohol, it all went away. And that's exactly what's happened with the drug war. They made these drugs illegal, beginning with marijuana, and the racist roots are clear of the war on marijuana. I mean, this is how they targeted Billie Holiday, and if you look today, I mean, the jail sentences that are given to blacks are inordinately higher than whites. They use the drug war. Bigoted cops use the drug war to stop blacks, pat them down, subject them to humiliating searches, maybe even kill them. And I'm not saying that all judges and all cops are bigots. What I'm saying is that when you have a system like this, it does attract the bigots. And to what avail? I told you I grew up on the border. I was a trial attorney for the first 12 years of my professional career, and I handled drug cases as a criminal defense lawyer. This thing's been going on for what, 50 years or so, and what good did it do to bust all those drug dealers when I was practicing law back in the 1970s and 80s? What good did it do? It did no good at all. And so, and all it does is create violence. I mean, look what they've done with Mexico. They've turned it into just a total hellhole of violence, kidnapping, killings, and so forth. And the final argument is perhaps the most important argument. What business is it of government to decide what I should put into my mouth? I mean, an essential aspect of a free society is to ingest whatever you want to ingest, whether it's fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, marijuana, alcohol, tobacco. No, I'm not here to tell you that these things are healthy or beneficial. I'm here to tell you that freedom entails the right to do these kind of things, and then just leave drug addiction and drug abuse in the hands of the private sector, drug rehab programs, Alcoholics Anonymous, those kind of things, narcotics groups that help people out. But to put that into the criminal justice system has just been an absolute disaster. So yeah, I believe this is a highly deadly, destructive, and racially bigoted government program that would be among my priorities to get rid of immediately. And yes, pardon every single nonviolent drug offender immediately upon taking office. They don't belong in jail. It's a horror story that people have gotten 30, 40 years, especially blacks, that have received these inordinately high jail sentences just for drug possession.
Now, your platform really centers on giving more power to the people, and one of the ways that's represented is in your tax policy. You say you want to remove taxes based on individual income and allow individuals to donate to areas they deem necessary. Now, I don't know if you recall the story, but there was a little bit of a famous example in 2010 in Obion County, Tennessee, where the local government let a house burn to the ground because the individual did not pay a $75 service fee. From what I'm gathering of what you said and your campaign, this is similar to what you are proposing, a similar sort of initiative regarding paying to certain areas of the government.
Well, it's not as simple as that. I certainly oppose the income tax. I mean, this has been one of the most highly destructive taxes in the history of this country. Our founding fathers were opposed to it. The framers of the Constitution. We lived without income taxation for more than 100 years. But then again, remember, I oppose the entire welfare state functions of the government and the national security state functions of the government. If you get down to the type of government that I favor, a truly limited government, you're talking about a government with very small expenditures. I mean, no more welfare state programs, including Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, no more giant Pentagon, CIA, NSA, vast military industrial complex, foreign military bases, domestic military bases, just a small basic military. You're talking about a small amount of money. So the question arises, okay, Jacob, how would you fund that? And I believe that the freest society in history will one day be the society where you have government, okay? I'm not an anarchist. I'm opposed to anarchy. I believe in government, but I believe that government can be voluntarily funded, where I think most people believe in government. They think it's important. They just don't want government to do bad things like the drug war. So if you have voluntary support, the government learns to live within its means. and that can work on a local basis, state level, and federal level. Let's keep in mind that under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government had no power to tax, none. And it was in existence for more than 10 years without the power to tax. On your example, I believe that things like fire protection should play no role in the functions of a government at any level of government. Why shouldn't fire protection just be done by private agencies, private companies? There's no reason why government has to provide fire protection. Now, if a person says, well, I'm not going to pay for that, okay, then you take your chances. It's like insurance. If you say, well, I'm not going to buy fire insurance for my house, okay. Well, but if your fire burns down, you can't run and cry and say, oh my gosh, bail me out, bail me out. Well, no, because you took the risk of not buying the fire insurance. And I think the same thing would apply in a private private enterprise system, where if a fire company says, hey, we want to sell this to you, and you say, nope, don't want to pay the money, you take your chances.
And talking more about the economy, millions of Americans are struggling with the high cost of living, high costs of groceries, and more. How would you propose stabilizing this?
Exactly what I said earlier. I mean, this is a direct consequence. And this is the thing we have to keep in mind. And this is what distinguishes my campaign from others, including my competitors within the party, is that I don't accept the status quo. I don't sit here and say that libertarians can solve your economic problems within the context of this welfare, warfare state way of life, regulated, managed economy way of life. You have a crisis, an economic crisis, and people say, what's the libertarian solution to this? Well, libertarians don't purport to have solutions to socialism. Socialism produces crises. And what I'm saying is we need to focus on shifting the system. So it's not a matter of getting better people in public office, as some people often suggest. It's a systemic problem. We've got a bad system, Michael. You got a welfare state system, okay, where the government is charged with taking care of people. You've got a regulated, managed economy system where the government is charged with controlling the economy, governing the economy. So the president is blamed whenever the economy goes in the tank, or he takes praise whenever the economy does well. And then you've got this massive warfare state system. I'm saying, let's shift systems. Let's get a limited government republic based on voluntary charity, where people are free to keep everything they earn. They decide what to do with it. And then you would see massive increase in the standard of living of people, especially the poor, because the poor are the ones that get hurt the most under this kind of system today, where the Federal Reserve is debauching the currency, inflating the currency, and then all of a sudden doing this panicky tightening up. This is a classic example of a managed economy, a government managed economy. So I'm not going to tell you that I'm here to tell you I can fix these problems. I'm here telling you that I favor a system that will raise the standard of living in such inordinate way, high ways that people, it's almost unimaginable.
Now, I do want to ask you about climate change before we end off here. In an effort to combat the climate crisis, President Biden signed an executive order in 2021 directing the federal government to be carbon neutral by 2050. Is there anything you would do as president regarding climate change? Doesn't sound like you want to prioritize that as president.
Well, that's right. But let me also say that I think its use of executive orders is abominable. I mean, this is no different from dictatorial decrees. Augusto Pinochet, the dictator of Chile, used to call executive orders decree laws, that whatever he decreed was the law. And that's the way presidents use these executive orders. They're decree laws, that I'm telling you how things are going to work. Well, that's not the way things are supposed to work. We have a legislative branch of government, and that's is charged with enacting the laws. So I totally oppose this idea of executive decrees. But yeah, I'm skeptical of the whole climate change business. But I will say this, and I'm not an environmental expert by any means. I will say this, though, that turning to the government to solve this problem or any other problem is the worst thing you can do, because as we've seen with agencies like the EPA, they turn into little tyrannical agencies that end up destroying people and destroying their property and destroy private property rights. I'm a firm believer in the ability of a free market to resolve problems in life. And I would just rely on the private property order and the free market to resolve these kind of problems.
Now, throughout this conversation, you've talked a lot about socialism. You've been a vocal critic of socialism. However, in the 2023 World Happiness Report, Finland, Denmark, Iceland, Sweden, and Norway all ranked within the top 7 happiest countries in the world. All those countries I mentioned employ a large welfare state, something you're vehemently against. You still disagree with socialism?
More fervently than ever. Look, people that are sucking opium in an opium den, they're as happy as they can be also. But it weakens a nation. When you've got an entire nation on the dole, everybody may be really happy because, look, they're being taken care of. The state's managing their lives, controlling their lives. Here's your food. Here's your gasoline. Here's your house. Oh, life is so pleasant, but it's the life of a slave. It's the life of the person who's being taken care of by the government. For me, that's not a fulfilling life at all. I want a life of independence, of self-reliance, of can-do, of voluntary charity, not this coercive apparatus. I mean, what happens to a person in those Scandinavian countries that says, I don't want to participate in this. I don't want to be a kept citizen. I want to be an independent, self-reliant individual. He can't do it. They won't let him. They say, no, you have to be one of us. And they force him to become a submissive little serf. And it inevitably weakens the nation. The nations where the government is weakest in terms of taking care of people are the strongest nations. The nations where the government is the most powerful in terms of taking care of people or invading people, those are actually your weakest countries. That's why people don't recognize that the United States is a very weak country. The nation is weak because you've got this massive welfare state where people are convinced that without the welfare, they would be dying in the streets. And then you've got this massive warfare state. And so, yeah. Now, there's another thing to consider here. How long?
What do you mean by a weak state?
A weak nation.
Weak nation.
Okay, I draw a distinction between the government and the nation. This is a distinction a lot of people don't understand. They think that the government and the nation are one and the same thing. It's two completely separate entities. And that's reflected by the Bill of Rights, which expressly protects the nation from the government, the federal government. So the stronger your government, the weaker your nation, the weaker your citizens are. Because let's take your Scandinavian example. When you've got a nation of people that are dependent on the state, the moral fiber of those people becomes weak. They're not, as compared to people that are like 19th century Americans, where there was no Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, income tax. These were strong individuals. And so you had a very weak government here in the United States in the 19th century, but a very powerful nation, because no one dares to invade a nation where people are genuinely free. Now, I'm excluding slavery. I'm not saying that was an example of that was a violation of slavery, no question about it. But if you take, let's say, 1890 America, this is a very powerful nation. Trying to invade a country where people have that kind of freedom is like swallowing a porcupine. But invading a country like Norway or Sweden is a fairly easy thing because the people are weak. The moral fiber is weak from having become dependent on this largesse. It just destroys the sense of self-reliance and can-do that characterizes individualism. There's another factor to consider here too. How long can this go on? You see, socialism depends on taxing the producers. This money doesn't come out of just nowhere. The government can't produce wealth. It can only confiscate wealth. So in the early years or even decades of socialism, you've got all these wealthy people, and it looks like, wow, this is a great system. You're confiscating the wealth of these wealthy people and to create this system. How long can that last? A lot of the wealthy people started leaving. They stopped producing. I mean, this was demonstrated in Ayn Rand's book, Atlas Shrugged. where the wealthy just shrug and say, we're not working anymore. We're not gonna keep producing if you're gonna steal from us. So it's that fine line of like a cow that a parasite is sucking from. The parasite is to be very careful he doesn't kill the cow. He has to keep the cow alive so he can keep sucking. And that's the way the welfare state works. You got to keep sucking out of those wealthy people, but you don't want to kill them. And the question is, how long can that go on?
Now, before we end off, what would you like to say to voters ahead of the Libertarian primary?
Well, we don't have primaries. Keep that in mind. The Libertarian Party, it's the Libertarian nominating convention that determines the candidate. But I mean, I got two separate audiences. I've got the American people, and to the American people, I'd say, look at the system that has been brought into existence by Democrats and Republicans. It's an evil system, this welfare warfare state, this death machine that kills people. I mean, this is the root cause of the woes that America is suffering, and that instead of thinking about getting better people in public office, think in terms of changing our system to a libertarian system. And to the members of the Libertarian Party, I'd say, look, we've been running candidates for 25 years now that favor reform of the welfare warfare state. That's their whole campaign platform. Welfare warfare state reform. Reform this, reform that, reform this, reform that. I say let's restore the brand of principled libertarianism on which the party was founded, that rejects reform and focuses on identifying the infringements on freedom and dismantling them and making the case for dismantling to our fellow Americans, because that's the only way that America can lead the world out of this morass of serfdom and slavery and misery and death, and lead the world to freedom, peace, prosperity, and harmony with the people of the world.
Libertarian candidate for President of the United States, Jacob Hornberger. Mr. Hornberger, thank you for taking the time to be here with me today.
The honor and pleasure all mine. Thank you, Michael.